Good afternoon. It's great to be here, and thanks so much for having me. It's an amazing opportunity here to speak in a privacy conference. It's actually one of the first times I've done this in speaking all these different crypto conferences and different opportunities in getting word out in the Web3 world. But to be here in a setting that's exclusively focused on privacy is really important to me, because I think that the issues around privacy actually animate so much about what I do on any given day. So I'm going to have an opportunity to introduce to you the Starling Lab, which is the culmination of about 3 years worth of work that we have done over at Stanford and at USC. And my goal today is to share with you a little bit about the framework that we've put together and understanding some of the tools that we've been evaluating. Introduce you to the lab so you can understand some of the dilemmas that are here we've uncovered, and finally look at the opportunity that certainly anyone here can be a part of helping us unpack. So let's go ahead and jump in and talk about this framework. The Starling Framework really grew out of this understanding that we had reached this era of misinformation and disinformation, and that as we were grasping for tools to help start to rebuild digital trust, we needed a way to evaluate all the different tools that were coming at us. And so we began this process really by putting together a group of experts that were over at Stanford and at USC. And our aim was to look specifically at individuals who had a deep technical expertise in cryptography, but then also pair them with folks that were in the human rights sector. And the combination of those two led to then the opportunity to bring together all these different organizations that helped us evaluate a number of different tools and come up with novel integration and novel implementation of these types of tools. So really the Starling Framework became essentially a way of looking at tools and principles to allow organizations to look at how they might securely capture, store, and verify information. And that framework meant that we were bringing up to the top of the stack open source prototypes that would really help illuminate the art of the possible. We then paired those with best practices that we developed in the field. And this is really critical. None of this has been an academic exercise, or I should say, purely academic exercise through and through. What we have done is we have looked at all of these different learnings actually as they play out in real time. So let me give you a really good example of something that we were a part of. The Content Authenticity Initiative was originally brought together by Adobe, the New York Times, and Twitter. And its sister project was Project Origin. And really what they were looking to do was to find ways of helping establish provenance that links the origin or the at-source authenticity of, let's say, an image or a video, all the way up to the point in which it gets published. And that project ended up getting merged into something called the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. And it's based out of the Linux Foundation, and they've really kept a good eye to being inclusive and trying to keep up their open source standards. So in theory, this is a really positive development in the space, because we have a lot of people that have come together to address this issue of provenance, so that we know whether or not an original of a photo or video is actually authentic. And that has then expanded now to look at things like graphics. And in the future, it might even look at authenticating things like big data archives. And as you think about the problems of mis and disinformation, a lot of it comes down to the fact that you just don't actually know where something has come from. And so the provenance opportunity here is immense. So what we think about then is that we're able to use cryptography as a way of authenticating information. So we know that it is uniquely identifiable, and that as it moves through its journey in an information ecosystem, we could understand how it might have been changed. And that, of course, is really the flip side of the other part of cryptography, which is to encrypt or to keep things private. And I think that the combination of these two things, specifically in this use case that we've been looking at, is really potent. And let me explain to you why. So if you look at it, the beginning of the process with any sort of endeavor where you're trying to capture information is that you acquire the information, let's say with an image, you take a photograph. And then you take that information and you store it somewhere in an environment that might be a staging environment for you to then do some maybe permissible enhancements of the image. And then finally, you go and you verify it. So in a news flow, let's say like the Reuters news flow for their photojournalism, they would go through this exact process, right? Photographers in the field would take photos, you'd store the information, and then finally editors in the UK would verify that information. Those three things are part of a century-old process of creating an information system workflow. And what we decided to do was to use that process and then introduce various methods of authentication at each step as you capture, store, and verify. And on the other end of that, we created a next generation archive, which we called the 78 days. And the idea behind it was that we were going to capture on each of the 78 days between the election and the inauguration photographs and put them through this process and really allow you to have more confidence in the entire signal flow that was presented. The motivation for this effort, you might say, well, like what could you possibly need this for? Well, it began with this photograph here. It was taken on January 20th, 2017, and it was basically a combination photo. That you can see here on the left-hand side, there was the photograph taken of Donald Trump's inauguration, and then on the right-hand side, you had Obama's inauguration from 8 years earlier. And what should have been a simple statement of fact from a newswire ended up being a tremendous source of controversy. And in fact, the administration dedicated its first full day in office to actually disputing the authenticity of the photographs that were released by the news media. And Sean Spicer took to the podium for his very first news conference to dispute the authenticity and to claim that he was bringing alternative photographs, which were then labeled alternative facts to what was, in his mind, the largest inauguration that was ever held. Well, Reuters was now suddenly in the crossfire. And this was a tremendous issue because the photographs they had put out there had been no manipulation done. They were just simply photographs taken from a photographer from the exact same vantage point, just 8 years in difference in length. So what we decided to do for the 2020 election, knowing that there were potential issues around people questioning the validity of photographs, we started a pilot during the California primary. And what we did is we took a Canon camera and we paired it with this phone that you see here on the left. And the phone served a special purpose. What it did is it established a series of authenticity markers around the time and the date and the location in which the phone was present. And that metadata payload was stored on this phone. And then as the Canon camera took photos, the image and the metadata was paired on the phone. And then we took that combined payload and we hashed it. And then we signed that hash on a secure enclave, which was on the phone. And what this allowed you to do is to establish authenticity directly at source on the device. And that meant that now as we take photos with the phone, we can then transmit the information of the pixels as well as the authenticity markers directly into the photos newswire that Reuters maintains. And this here you see their CMS. And within that CMS, you now had this additional information around the at source authenticity. You can see here the media key and the media hash. And then as editors made changes, let's say to bylines, so in this case, I made a change to this demo here, I can now add, let's say, additional information in this caption, and we can now push out with webhooks that information onto a federated blockchain platform, which in this case, we use the Hyperledger Fabric system. And what we did seconds later was essentially authenticate the change that was made in the CMS. And then from there, we push the information out to a public ledger. And you can see that registered here. And so that information seconds later appears on that public ledger, and the entire transaction is put out there as ciphertext, and it's essentially hashed so that you're able to establish now an auditable trail that goes all the way from the camera to the point of publication. Now, what are the next steps? Well, after you have all that information, you can actually take it and you can present it to the end reader. And what the good people who were developing a number of these standards thought of was that actually you could take this information and potentially even embed it inside of a photograph, so that now the authenticity of the information is embedded in the photograph and therefore it's portable. And as you present the information to end readers, what could happen is you could write a little web app that extracts the information out of the photograph and presents it to the end reader. So you can establish who was the photographer, the date in which this photograph was taken, the location, etc., and then link back to the decentralized web where we registered all this different information. So you can see here as an example now, really the photograph transforms from being a container of information to actually being a container of metadata as well, and then links back to the decentralized web. So now this time around, when we look back at this photo, well, if we turn to what happened in the inauguration, it's really incredible to think that we have this period of time that was sealed into the historical record with these new authenticity tools. And surely, I don't think anyone could have anticipated what had happened during those 78 days. They were indeed quite fraught. And there was a tremendous amount of activity, no less, on January 6th, which brought into question really the state of our democracy. And surely, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, you can appreciate that the demonization of the media, and specifically in this case, calls for violence against the media, is something that's deplorable. And the question was whether or not new tools and new authenticity markers could potentially help restore some of the information that photographers are really at risk of getting lost as photos and video are spread across the internet. So now you too can see this prototype. It's available at our lab website, starlinglab.org/78 days. You can see for yourself each of those 78 days and see all the different authenticity markers. They're embedded in the photos, and get a glimpse really of the next generation of authentication of photography. So this brings me now to the lab, because you could see that really what was at stake here in creating this type of prototype was an experiment. And if you take our framework and you think about what we've put forward, so open source prototypes, we've tried to evaluate best practices, and as we've explained, we're working in the field. What the lab's purpose is to really think of how we could look at these open source prototypes and bring in more individuals to help make them more sophisticated and to evolve them in an impact accelerator. We could look at the best practices and develop courses and publications. And finally, our in-field case studies are things that we're now building out into full fellowships. So the Starling Lab, in a sense, is really an integrated approach to doing all the things that we've done over the last 3 years as a research project, now into an academic research center that's exploring how Web3 technologies can be a part of rebuilding digital trust. And we're doing that across 3 different domains: history, law, and journalism. So what is our opportunity? Well, I think that there must be a bunch of people sitting around, certainly in a privacy conference, thinking, well, this is all really interesting information to think of how it might help combat mis and disinformation, but surely there are a lot of privacy questions that arise with this type of authentication technology. And so when you think of Web3, and you think of all the opportunities that are being presented with immutable ledgers, with varying measures of authenticity, to me, really, it's that the concern that's raised is that Web3 is not actually an answer or a perfect answer, but rather I see it merely for what it is: an opportunity. An opportunity can be taken in a number of different ways. So let me take the prototype and now complicate it. So for example, when you look at the prototype here and you look at the injection of the metadata information in this photograph, well, in this case, we have a photograph that's being presented, but yet it has a variety of different dilemmas that are presented to end users. In fact, Witness has evaluated all this and come up with 14 different dilemmas in which you could really think of an authenticated photograph not as necessarily something that is helping photographers, potentially putting them at risk. Specifically, when you think about it, it's the question around choice and whether or not the disclosure of this information around authenticity is something that's being done at the full agency of the photographer. That is a tremendous risk. And in fact, in looking at this information, what we then sought to uncover with various precedents, much to our surprise, was that not only had this type of system been implemented, but it had been implemented in North Korea, where they had used exactly this type of authentication technology to surveil individuals, because every photograph that was taken on approved devices in North Korea was transformed from being just simply a photograph with anonymity to being a photograph that was linked to a specific device and therefore to a specific person who held the account that registered that device. So that posed a huge set of issues for us. And similarly, the storage technologies that we're using, they're decentralized and they're open source. So you would think, well, we've solved all the problems, right? This is now suddenly an inherently ethical technology. And yet, of course, nothing could be farther from the truth, because when you look at open source technology, it has never been deterministic. And if you look at all the problems that have existed within Web 2, many of the issues that come to define like the critical ethical questions of our day with technology around bias in our algorithms or the various invasions on our privacy, well, surely those came out of open source technologies as well. So we understand the benefits of open source for sure, but we also understand that it takes continuous effort by people and platforms to maintain proper values to ensure that we don't go down these dangerous paths. And specifically, when we think about open source, we might think about the lived experience of the individuals who create open source technology and realize really that there are still immense issues with representation with open source. It tends to skew young, white, and male. And so we have a lot of work to be done to ensure that the right values are actually coded into these open source projects. And then finally, when you look at the opportunities with distributed ledger, I mean, there are many questions around really the euphoria that has come with these types of open source tools as they've now become immensely profitable for individuals. And surely the example with El Salvador and Bitcoin in that experiment, I think anybody with a sense of history can understand how that there has been a long and difficult history of imperial economic aggression around Latin America. And I think there are very clear ways of linking the good neighbor policies of the 30s to the Bretton Woods agreements that caused a tremendous amount of problems for Latin America that we're still unpacking today. And yet, at the same time, the individuals who put forward Bitcoin at the government of El Salvador yet still need to be held to task. If you look at the human rights records of the governing institutions in El Salvador, they are by no means sterling, and they are a cause of tremendous concern. Look no further than February, when the soldiers were marched into legislative assembly in order to pass legislation. This is certainly no model of democracy or human rights. Similarly, when you look at the euphoria around the idea of a borderless form of currency, look no further than Bitcoin's hashing rate, which has transformed in the last 2 years from China being the far leader in the space to now being completely wiped off the map with bans that have come from the government. So one still has to ask questions around what is the role of government, even with these technologies. And to me, really, this comes back to a sense of euphoria that happened back with Web 2. And the real danger with Web 2 was that essentially we believed that these tools and these tools alone would be a way to basically change governments for the better. So you look back to the Arab Spring, the thought was the only tools needed, Twitter and Facebook. And Mark Zuckerberg was listed as a potential finalist for the Nobel Peace Prize at the time. I think that we can all understand how naive that type of thinking was. And so I think the same thing comes back to things like digital currencies. We need to be very careful as to what types of hopes and dreams we pin on them. And specifically with things like central bank currencies, if you match those to things like, let's say, a social credit system, as China is certainly posed to do with their social currency raise, that's combined with now their central bank currency, I think it's a truly a scary opportunity for us to behold. And so we decided at the lab to really take the panoply of issues here and really try to create some ordering to them. And so if you go to starlinglab.org, what to get right first, we have a really incredible essay that was written by one of the foremost experts on human rights online. And she explains the types of things that we need to be keeping diligent about. So with that, I'll wrap up and just emphasize to everyone how excited we are to begin this conversation and to have 2 feet planted in the privacy debates that continue to exist. We are looking at authenticity technology holistically. So we understand all of its benefits, but as I think everyone here has a stake in, we also want to make sure that it is privacy preserving as well. So with that, I'll cede it back. Thank you.